listening to Coffee and Conversation with Recovery Advocate Network, the nonprofit organization that strives to address the staggering disparity in resource availability for individuals suffering from mental health disorders, processing disorders, addictions, trauma healing, and sexual identity challenges. Together, we strive to end the stigma associated with these challenges so that true healing can begin. Welcome back to Coffee and Conversation with Recovery Advocate Network. I'm your host, Ange, and I welcome you to episode number 16. Today's guest, Jodi, shares her personal story of opiate addiction that started as a very young child while treating her migraines. We also talk about her childhood sexual trauma and the long-term struggle healing from both challenges. Since this episode deals with addiction, sexual trauma, complex PTSD, and also references religious imposed barriers, we want to remind you that if you feel triggered, we encourage you to contact your support system, therapist, national and community support groups, the Global Crisis Text Line by texting 741-741, and/or, if in the United States, dialing 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. So, what are we waiting for? Fill up your coffee and let's get started. Good afternoon, listeners. This is Ange, your host, and I have Jodi here as today's guest. I'm very excited about this episode because Jodi is here and she is going to share her personal story of challenges, pain, struggle, and I'm going to give a teaser, ultimate recovery story. So I believe these stories are best told by the individual themselves. So I will press mute and allow you, Jodi, kick us off and tell us why you're here today.
Thanks so much, Ange. I am here today to share my story. Definitely, I think in hopes that I want somebody to know, from my story that there can be hope, no matter how bad your story can seem. And I really like to share that. So I'd like to say I'm a recovering addict and I'm a survivor of child and adolescent trauma. Trauma has had a lot of effects in my life. Some of them have been in the form of medical problems. I've done outpatient therapy off and on over time. I've done several inpatient stays, and they were useful in their own way. But currently, I've made it where I'm happier and healthier than ever, mentally and physically. So that's great. My mental health journey really starts in my childhood. I was the youngest of three girls. We were each 4 years apart. My dad, he worked quite a bit, and my mom, she worked from home. We had a hair salon in our house, and she was a hairstylist. And we were a very conservative Christian family. We were in the church at least 3 times a week. And I think, from the outside looking in, we looked very traditional, like a very average family. And like many ways we were. What most people didn't know, though, was that behind closed doors and kind of an unspoken rule that you didn't talk about was that my mom's mental health was really fragile. She had severe depression. She would have long periods where she was really angry and she didn't speak to us. And part of the time she did a lot of compulsive spending. And then part of the time she was a really awesome mom. And so sometimes I think that's the part that was sort of crazy making was you never knew what you were going to get from day to day. Like whether she was going to be sad or angry. And when she was like that, it was like I really, really just longed for that nice mom to come back. And I loved my mom very much. And I believe she really wanted to be a good mom and she loved me, but she was also a product of her family of origin and her own mother's mental health problems. And left untreated, mental health issues and their effects can be generational. I'm sure you've seen that. We've heard those stories time and again. But as a kid, as early as I can remember, I was an extremely anxious kid, very fearful. I worried constantly. Like, I didn't want to be left anywhere, like school, church, class. I was always afraid that I was going to be forgotten, like my mom wasn't going to come back. I remember my mom and dad trying really hard to get me to go to school without crying. I even got a dog out of it, which I had for 15 years. And so,
being a dog lover, can I interrupt and ask what kind of dog?
Oh, what kind of dog? Yes. It was a Shih Tzu. Yes, Willie.
I couldn't resist. Okay. I hope I didn't throw you off too much, but my heart exploded.
You're good. But also in those early elementary years, I developed migraines. I saw a neurologist for the first time when I was about 7, and I was given meds to prevent the migraines, and I was also given Tylenol with codeine, which is an opiate, for severe pain. But I specifically remembering it making the pain better, but it also made me feel better emotionally. And I remember that specifically from when I was very young. And the passage of time seems different when you're young. And so I did experience sexual abuse from someone outside my family when I was very young. But I don't really have a concept of when that struck. Was it before or after the pain and the fear? But I do believe that sexual abuse and my mom's mental health greatly affected my mental health. Also in therapy, I learned that sexual predators seek out vulnerable children. And I think, I fit in that category just with what all went on with my mom. I never disclosed the abuse to my family because even at that young age, I remember feeling shame. By the time I finished elementary, I had really gotten right to push those feelings aside, kind of really far down. But one thing I couldn't suppress was that physical pain. And I became a really great student in spite of it. I was a hard worker, followed all the rules. I was just overall a really great kid, but, just dealt with a lot of pain. About the age of 12, I had another particularly difficult year. I was sexually abused over a period of time by a family acquaintance. And in October of that year, we had a big house fire. And my sister had just moved out to college, and she and I were very close. And so that was already very hard for me. And so we had this house fire, and we had to move to a hotel for 3 months. And I didn't see my parents a whole lot because they spent all their free time remodeling the house. The house fire is really what ended the access that the perpetrator had to me. And so in some ways, it was sort of a weird blessing. But again, I didn't disclose this to my parents. And there's a whole lot of reasons. I knew my parents were under a lot of stress. I was also always really protective of my mother. I didn't think she could handle the information. And also, again, there's a lot of shame related to it. Sexual purity was something that was very important in our family and with faith and, to me. And I totally had felt like that had been ruined. And, I worried a lot about would I be going to hell because I wasn't quote unquote pure. Struggled with PTSD symptoms and flashbacks and nightmares and all that for a really long time afterwards. And then as I got to high school age, both my sisters had moved out of the house. My mom, she took a job outside of the house, and my dad, he traveled a lot. So I was the only child at home, and that really meant I received the brunt of my mom's anger and moods. So I really found solace in going to school at that time, which is kind of ironic. But as the last child, I really felt like, my parents were really done being parents. My second year of high school, my dad's job moved to a new state, and my mom transferred her job. So I was leaving the friends that I had all my life. I'd never had to make new friends. But the first 2 friends that I made were in my math class in my new school. And one day, the 2 boys offered me a ride home from school. And it ended with a sexual assault. And my parents were gone for the weekend. They were finishing up the sale of our house. And so I came home to an empty duplex. We hadn't bought a house yet. And I vividly remember telling myself, this did not happen. And the PTSD symptoms hit me really, really hard. Really a lot of shame associated with it again. I remember the thoughts. It was like, how could I have been so stupid? Like, you don't trust guys. I mean, how could I take a ride with them? I mean, how could I think they wanted to be my friend? My biggest thought, and one of the ones I had the hardest time with, was what's wrong with me? It's like, why does this keep happening? What is it that I'm doing? And so kind of another funny part of that story would be, shortly after I was asked out by a guy and I repeatedly turned him down, but he was persistent and very kind. And eventually I went out with him, and now we've been married 25 years, and he is still my number one. He's my rock, my supporter, my safe place, and he has kept me laughing even when there was nothing funny about life. But even so, I didn't disclose any of this information to him either. And in those years after high school, my headaches were still very bad. As a high school student, on my own, I sought out doctors, even at like the age of 16 for treatment of pain. I don't even think my parents knew what medication I was on at 16. We got married after our second year of college, despite that, the fact that my mom was not in favor. But marriage brought about some new challenges for me. I had chosen to save sex for marriage. So when we were married, I knew that my husband loved me more than anything and would never hurt me. But those feelings that were associated with it automatically were fear and pain, resentment, and shame. And through therapy, I learned that that was normal. Like in PTSD reactions, like when the stress response is activated, it's like the part of the brain that has reason and knows, how to tell time is shut down. And so you think you're back there fighting for your life. And so that really kind of helped to have some understanding to that. But I eventually graduated from my 4-year nursing program with a 4.0. But emotionally, I was falling apart. My migraines were frequent, and I often treated them with prescribed opiates, which I found numbed all the pain, physical and emotional. And then we were married 3.5 years whenever I had our first child. Like the hormones associated with pregnancy really made the headaches bad also. And so the only safe treatment that they had in pregnancy was the opiates, and that is what we used. And when my child was 15 months old, it was the first time I admitted to the doctor that I was addicted to the opiate pills that were prescribed. And I went to detox for the first time. At that time, I remember feeling totally defeated. I was a total failure. I'd been a good person, a good nurse, and now I was an addict. It's like one of the things you don't want to be when you're a nurse is an addict. And I felt so much shame in letting everybody know, my husband, my family, and and that was really hard. But overall, I have to say they were very supportive, and I'm grateful for that. I started therapy at that time for the first time in my life, and she was an amazing therapist, and I have no doubt that she positively changed the course of my life and is, one of the blessings that came out of the mess. Then when I had 1 year of recovery, we made the decision to have baby number 2, and I got pregnant very quick. Unfortunately, with the hormone changes, my migraines were very bad again. And my doctors decided that the opiates were probably the safest way to go and that we could just deal with the ramifications after she was born. I continued to use the prescription opiates as physical and mental pain relief that I was still having. And then after I had my second child, they tried weaning the pain meds, but I was really totally lost in the addiction again and postpartum depression. Yeah, I guess despite my efforts of not knowing that it was a problem for me. And then in this time period, I was still working with my therapist. And at one point in one of my sessions, and I guess really through years of experience, she'd kind of picked up enough information that she directly asked me if I had been sexually abused. But she was very specific about it. And without thinking, it really took me by surprise. And it was like the truth, that I'd kept hidden just kind of fell out without me really expecting it. Because it was like I had no plans of ever disclosing this information. I had really told myself for so long this didn't happen. But I really only talked to her about what happened whenever I was 12. And I didn't want her to know that there was more, because that must have meant that there was something about it that was my fault. My therapist also at that time brought my husband in and helped me tell him about that, but I didn't disclose any more to him at that time either. In my daughter's first year of life, I ended up going to detox multiple times. Eventually, my doctor recommended going to a longer term rehab, and it was actually especially for healthcare providers. It was in another state, but unfortunately it wasn't covered by our insurance, and we took out, a second mortgage on our house. I ended up staying there for 4 months, and it truly was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. That year, I missed Christmas, New Year's, both of my kids' birthdays, and there was so much guilt with that. While I was there, I did self-report to the nursing board because they said it would help with recovery to have the accountability of the nursing board. I had random drug screens for 3 years after that, and I would say it was really good to have that accountability. Unfortunately, in my first year of recovery, my therapist died, and that again hit me really, really hard. But eventually, I was able to start working with another therapist, and I was after this, I'd been able to go back to work for the first time as a nurse. And it was really so good to be back, doing what I loved and something that I felt good at and that I was passionate about. And the therapist I was seeing at the time, she was a friend of my previous therapist, and she was very good. Unfortunately, I just didn't feel like I was ready to talk about the trauma with somebody else. And then the next year, my mom died suddenly and unexpectedly. And that was, again, very hard for me. My mom was a really wonderful grandma to my kids. She was always very supportive of my recovery. And so her loss was really hard. In 2013, I quit work again because of the head pain. And then after about 5 years of recovery, and I was still fighting the head pain, I started to slip. And I spent a lot of time at the ER for pain. I had several unrelated surgeries, and I had a PCP who was very happy to prescribe opiates. We sought out centers of excellence for head pain across the United States, and I stayed for weeks in multiple facilities, but nobody really made much progress on the pain. But in about probably 2015, I learned of an experimental surgical procedure that showed mixed results for migraines. But I pursued it because I had nothing left to lose. I mean, I had no life. I couldn't see a future with me in it. I was in constant pain. I was in a lot of guilt over, not being really available for my kids. And the only reason I really stayed around was for my kids. I looked at the research on suicide and kids, and I just couldn't make that choice at the time. So in 2016, I had the surgery, and it was a 7-hour surgery, and it was almost immediately successful. The recovery from the surgery was really, really long, but they were weaning the opiates. And then even with the pain gone, though, the depression was still there, and I really struggled with that recovery. I was struggling especially with flashbacks and nightmares without anything to kind of numb the pain. My health in general was not good. It was getting where, I had spent so many years on the couch, and I couldn't walk to the back of the store without sitting down. I ended up having a bout of sepsis and was in the hospital for a little while. I had something called Stevens-Johnson syndrome. It was related to a medication that I was on, and I had a lot of necrosis, and so I had a year of wound care and some severe scarring. But basically all that to say I was in a really desperate place. I sought out the therapist that I had before, and she recognized that my health was in a really, really bad place. And we couldn't address the mental health really until I could get my physical health to a better place. And she really helped me with that. She was patient, and she would just tell me, like, before you leave my parking lot, you need to sit out there and call this person. It's like, make an appointment with this doctor. And so, that was really, really helpful for me. I needed somebody at that time just to walk me through it. I learned that I had arrhythmia in my heart, and it's most likely what my mom had died of. And I got a pacemaker, and after that I really started to feel stronger, and like maybe I could start to deal with the trauma. I began to open up about all the trauma to this therapist, and we finally started to work on it. But I really struggled with recovery during this time. It was recovery relapse. And I felt like I needed to go inpatient and do that. I'd been successful with that before, and so I really wanted to do that. I'd say my therapist was really wonderful, but there is just some things that you can get from inpatient that you can't do in an outpatient therapy. So I talked to my husband and we made a plan. And so in 2019, I was approved to go inpatient at a facility that specializes in trauma. I weaned the addictive meds before I actually went inpatient. And I was really trying to tell myself that if I addressed the trauma, the addiction component wouldn't be a problem. And I knew this was an amazing opportunity. I knew it wasn't going to be cheap. I dealt with a lot of guilt over the fact that my family had already spent so much money on treatment and health care. And I felt like this was really going to be my last chance. I worked really hard in the program and, it was really good. I went home after 2 months. But unfortunately, after digging out all the trauma, it's a really long process. You don't get there in a day and you don't get out of it in a day. And so going home to kind of continue working on that, but I didn't put in any safeguards for the addiction recovery. And I relapsed fairly quickly after getting home. So at this point, I was really, really hopeless. I mean, I felt like I had started with some promise, but I had totally failed everything in my life. I felt really trapped by the addiction, and I truly wanted off the ride of life, but I just couldn't do it to my family. I decided eventually to talk to my husband and tell him that I really felt like I needed more help. And in 2021, we made arrangements to go back to that same facility and to work on the trauma, but this time I also acknowledged the fact that I needed help with addiction too. And that stay is what really totally changed my life. I was scared of going home, that I would fail, that I would get back on my corner of the couch and not get up, that I would be stuck like I had with the pain and the depression. And my inpatient therapist had said, don't sit down until you're sure you can get up again. And been in recovery now close to 2.5 years. I still don't sit on that corner of the couch, but really not because I'm unsure. It's because I have a life that I want to live. And so I'm just so grateful for that. I've gone back to work as a nurse and love the feeling of having purpose and being good at something. My last day in treatment, I learned jewelry. It's really been a good outlet for me for creativity, stress reduction. I sell at craft fairs, and that's been really fun. And I also volunteer with pregnant teenagers. We just celebrated our 25th anniversary and had a really good trip. And so I still get an occasional migraine. They respond very quickly to medications, but I've really been taking control of my health. There are still times I have nightmares or flashbacks. Life is not perfect, but I have to deal with the problems that arise, and so I can take control of that now. I can never forget that I will always, always be an addict, but I'm in recovery now. My therapist, she used to tell me that she was holding hope for me until I could hope for myself. And so I am glad now that I'm finally in that place. At times that I still have the guilt pop up over the wasted years and over all I missed with my kids. But I do hope that my children saw that I never gave up. I fought for life, and I hope that I model resilience to them, and I hope that helps them in their life. Thank you.
I love your story. You're just so amazing, and I'm so grateful that you shared so many different parts of it, because communities and listeners, I really hope you will share this episode with a lot of people, because the stigma of addiction and the ignorance around where addiction comes from continues to just blow my mind. When individuals look at someone who's an addict and they put blame and shame and guilt and all of these thoughts on these individuals, and when the reality is, addicts don't just one day decide, hey, guess what, I want to be an addict and be miserable and feel trapped and consider ending my life and making this decision, should I spend my money on my addiction versus on lunch? Should I do that? that is not something a quote unquote sane individual will do. No, that is something an addict will do. And an addict comes from some place of need, of hurt, of pain. It's built through years of mistreatment and situations that individuals should not have to go through. And yet they do. And those situations that individuals go through are often hidden. And they're hidden because the individuals who are the victims in this are taught to hide them. They are taught as if it's their fault, as if they should be shameful of it, as if they can't speak up because they will be shamed for it. And I love some of the things that you said that really speak up to some other topics. We've talked repeatedly on this podcast about Body Keeps the Score. And so, listeners, if you've not read the book yet, seriously, just read the book because it will be a game changer in all areas. And oftentimes we talk about the Body Keeps the Score as we're talking about some of the episodes, like Maddie's story on episode 9, where we talked about it with Rainbow on episode 7. I believe I probably talked about it on episode 1 when I shared my personal story. And I know good gracious, we've probably talked about it on 75% of the episodes. Point being is this, that predators know how to target. And I don't believe predators are thinking in their head, oh, this person has been a victim and therefore they're a target. That's not really how the psychology of this probably works. Listeners, I'm not an expert in this, so please do not leave comments and say, no, that's not how the science works. What I'm saying is that it's just a natural component of it, is that individuals who have experienced these traumas, science does show, there's plenty of research that shows they're more likely to be victims of it. Well, a consequence of it, and why I found that book and that treatment and what you just shared, Jodi, to be so powerful is you said that when you shared that you were telling your therapist who said, finally, did you have sexual trauma? And you told that therapist about you when you had sexual trauma when you were 12. And you didn't want to tell that therapist about earlier times because you thought it would make it seem like it was then your fault. Because, wow, if it happened repeatedly, then you must have wanted it. You must have searched it. You must have all of these things, the stories we tell ourselves in our head, like what Brene Brown might have said. When, in fact, that's not the case, that typically individuals who have been abused once are at higher risk of being abused, whether it's sexually, physically, that kind of thing. And society looks at individuals who are in domestic violence relationships, and they judge those individuals. And I will say men or women, because men can also be in domestic violence relationships and go back. Is they look at them and say, well, why they just keep choosing dating people that are going to do this to them? It's their fault. It's not like a conscious decision that you choose this. So thank you for sharing that you were fearful of disclosing that additional trauma. And when we are, listeners, when we are fearful of disclosing this, then what it does is it delays our healing. And quite frankly, every individual deserves to heal. We deserve to live a full life. I just recorded an episode yesterday on meditation and mindfulness. And so that episode will come out as episode number 14. And it's on mindfulness and meditation. It's a great episode. I cannot wait for it. But one of his quotes in there is, every life matters, including yours. Start acting like it. And so when I think about that quote, I think of this. Every life matters. So Jodi, your life matters. And so any way you can work through that healing, that's so amazing. So one, thank you for sharing that you were afraid of talking about that earlier trauma because you thought you'd be judged about it. And then I also like the little quote that you said. Basically, we hear a lot about grief not being linear, healing also is not linear. And you said that you didn't get there in a day, so you're not going to get out in a day. And I think that oftentimes, especially individuals that go into treatment for anything, it could be for a mental health disorder, for an addiction. I mean, it could be anything that we think, okay, we should be able to just go into treatment for this period of time and then come out and we are miraculously healed, despite the fact we may have spent 30 or 40 years dealing with this. And we think that of ourselves, and then we come out and we're not healed. And so then we feel disappointed, we feel shame, we feel guilt, and all of those. Additionally, family members in the community, you may look at this individual and say, why are they not healed? And judge them and say, well, they've been to rehab or they've been to treatment this many times, they're a failure. It's just not the way that it works. It does take time. That individual might also have only been able to tell about the trauma they had when they were 12 and not been ready to tell about the rest of that trauma, and they need to work through that. One thing that struck me is, especially when it deals with the opioid crisis, is when you got pregnant and your doctor said, well, you're going to have to go on the opioids and we'll just deal with it afterward.
Yeah.
How does that make you feel now when you know how it impacted your life afterwards?
I feel like there had to be a better plan. I don't know what it would have been, but I feel like there had to be a better plan.
I just think there have got to be a lot of listeners who probably heard you say that and could instantly relate to doctors who gave them medications, not understanding the full impact of what that drug would have on them long term.
Sure, yeah.
So that really stood out to me. The other thing that really stood out to me is you having that conversation and the thought about the suicide component of it and doing research on the impact of suicide on your children. We, on this podcast, have done several episodes talking about suicide. Episode 2, Jim talked about his brother who struggled his entire life with schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and completed suicide and the impact it had on him. Episode 4 was on the Semicolon Project. I've talked about suicide ideations and struggles that I've had with it. And we have, I believe it was maybe on episode 3, might have been another episode where individuals talked about suicide and impact, or it might have been tied into episode 4. Anyways, we've talked a lot about suicide, and I do want to say you also, that whole feeling of being trapped, and I just want to speak out to individuals on all areas of it, because it is that idea of that pain and the nightmares and just your level of resilience at the end of what you were saying, and just how proud you are of yourself. That makes me so happy, because yes, I'm sure your children and your family and those around you are so very proud of you. Because listening to your story, all I could think of is you had so many opportunities to just say, flip it, I'm done, peace out, I'm done. And you didn't. You explored every opportunity and you reported to the nursing board, risked losing your license, and you went to treatment repeatedly. You didn't comment on right now, but I know you took out big loans to pay for treatment. That was a huge financial investment for your family, which a lot of people don't understand. It's not like your insurance just pays constantly for you to do these things. The doctors were very, very quick to give you the drugs that got you addicted, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're then going to pay to help you get unaddicted. Pretty sure that's not a correct word, but you get my point. So just you being brave about that, but the feeling of feeling trapped at this point, listen, if you're listening and thinking, wow, she did all of these things. At some point, everyone deserves to live a life worth living. And you just continued, even going through that 7-hour surgery, and all of that fighting is just amazing. But listeners, I will because this episode does talk about suicide, I will include in the show notes resources if you're feeling triggered and if you need someone to talk to and to kind of walk through those feelings of feeling triggered by that. And then I also thought a couple of the other things that you mentioned that really touched me was one, that fear of going home. So having been in treatment myself and also reading a lot of books. So I just finished reading the book Dry by Augustin Burroughs, which is a phenomenal book. He talks about his addiction to alcohol and talks about being in treatment and different individuals being in treatment and being fearful of going home. And it makes sense because when you're in residential treatment and you start exploring those traumas and you're in a quote unquote safe environment and you don't have those external triggers, you don't have individuals who expect some stuff from you and don't really understand why you're reacting the way that you are and all of that. And you don't have access to your drug of choice. And when I mean your drug of choice, it could be anything. It could be codependency. It could be OCD. It could be sex addiction. It could be self-harm. It could be opiates. It could be alcohol. It could be cocaine. It could be anything. So you don't have access to that when you're in treatment. And now you're starting to feel good. Your mind is clear. And you think, wow, I'm afraid to go home because when I go home, all of those stressors and triggers and individuals who don't really understand what I've been through and the healing journey I'm still on, because as you said, I didn't get here in a day or a month. I'm not going to get out in a day or a month. And so being afraid to go home and be surrounded by those drugs of choices is real. So can you talk about, especially, your last time and your fear of going home, a little bit more about that? And I mean, you're 2.5 years clean from opiate addiction. So tell me a little bit more about that. I know the one thing was don't sit on the couch. So you still don't sit on that part of the couch.
Yep. I would say one of the huge benefits I get in a treatment setting is routine. And so I brought that with me whenever I came home. It's like, I don't care what I'm doing. I get up and get dressed and get ready. I make the bed. I've made the bed every day for the last 2.5 years because it's part of the routine and it's what keeps me sane. And just also having that creative outlet, or something to do whenever I'm bored so that, I'm not getting into things I shouldn't be doing. It's just helpful to have something to be able to focus on. And then also that kind of is also, that helps you de-stress.
I love that. Routine is so important. And now, do you have any specific mantras that you say to yourself? Do you go to support groups? I think everyone's healing journey is different and what keeps them sober is different. Do you have any that work specifically for you?
No, I can't say that I use any specific mantras. I still go to therapy once a week. I've been off and on to, I've done some Celebrate Recovery and I've done AA and NA for a time. And I think those definitely have their place. Sometimes what I found for myself was, especially for like NA and AA, I didn't feel like I specifically fit there because it didn't feel like a great fit for my story. But also I saw people that it was obviously what they needed and they found their family there that did have really similar stories. And so
I love that you just said that. So when I was at Blue Ridge, one of the things that they said that I think applies to all types of tools for recovery or for actually just growing in all areas of life is this. Right. So let's just say you're an alcoholic. I'm just using that as an example. If you were drinking and you went to a bar and you didn't like that particular bar, you just went to another bar. So you found a bar that you fit in with, and that's what you went to. So in recovery, for example, you go to one sort of recovery group and you don't fit in and you don't like it, no big deal. You just go and find another one. Or if you try one modality of healing or growing or support network or hobby, or let's say this, you decide you want to have a hobby that's healthy, a form of exercise. So let's say you say, okay, I'm going to start exercising. So you decide to cycle and you don't like cycling. It doesn't mean you're going to stop exercising. You may just decide to swim instead. So deciding that I'm just going to stop recovery altogether because I don't like NA, no. NA is perfect for some individuals, just like cycling is perfect for some individuals. And NA is not perfect for others, so they find something else. And so I think the beauty of healing and the plethora of options that we have is that you can do that. And so I want to tie that into, I love that you said in recovery that, or in treatment, you started making jewelry. So I just interviewed, in episode 13 is Chrissy Clark. She's the director of Ripple Ranch. And in that, we talked about looking for treatment centers. And I know the treatment center that you went to had options where you could do a variety of things, such as EMDR, yoga, drumming. I'm trying to think of some other things. Obviously, jewelry, art. I know art was another big thing there. Going to the tree. There was a labyrinth there, which I actually loved labyrinth there. Funny story about the labyrinth there. Okay. Janine, who was on episode 8, Janine challenged me to do the labyrinth. Okay. I was a really hard client. So anyone who had me at any of my treatment centers is going to be laughing at this. And I said, I do not want to do this stupid labyrinth. This was like really boring. Not to mention I had a service dog. So if you ever tried to walk through this like labyrinth, and it wasn't one that had really tall trees that you're walking through. So I'm like zigzagging through with my 85-pound German Shepherd. This is stupid. But I said, fine, I'll do it. And so I can't remember how many, I think maybe it was like the 10th day of doing the labyrinth that I finally said, okay, I actually do love this. Point being is that having the opportunity in a safe space to find some of those healing things that keep you busy, allow you to have a meditative thing, such as making jewelry, and taking that newfound hobby skill, whatever, home with you, and then using it and selling it in craft stores and having that be a memory of your recovery is really special.
There was actually something that started me on it in the beginning. The first day I had at that facility, a lady that I was there with, whenever I had let people know that I was going to be going back to the treatment facility, she sent me a care package there, and it had a necklace in it. And I never would have considered wearing jewelry before because I barely even got dressed. And so it became a part of my routine. Every day I put on the necklace. And so then I started making my own jewelry. And then it's a part of getting yourself ready and feeling like you look nice. And so that was sort of, I guess, the impetus for starting making jewelry.
Getting up, getting dressed, making your bed, and feeling good about yourself. Those things are, those self-care, there's research around that. Daily living, daily activities living, something like that. I can't remember.
Daily living.
There you go.
Your ADLs, yes, your ADLs.
You should ask the nurse on the podcast what those are, your ADLs. That's amazing. That is absolutely amazing. And then 2 things I want to tie up, and then I want to find out what your motivational quotes are. But one is just a reminder that, just to you, a reminder that you said you never gave up and you fought for your life. And that, oh, my heart swells on that. And then the second thing that you said, and I've heard this before, but I want to say this to I strongly believe that there is some listener out there that is listening to this episode that is maybe at chapter 1 of their life, and they're really, 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 really feeling low and distressed and maybe feeling hopeless and thinking, I'm never going to get where Jodi is. And what I want to say is perhaps that Jodi and I right now are willing to hold hope for you until you can hold hope for yourself.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Now, Jodi, what motivational quote or quotes do you want to share with us today?
Okay, I have a couple. The first one would be, perhaps the butterfly is proof that you can go through a great deal of darkness, yet still become something beautiful. And that is by an author named Beau Taplin. And then the other one is, success is not final, failure is not fatal, it is the courage to change that counts. And that's Winston Churchhill.
The courage to change that counts. I love that. Awesome. Well, thank you, Jodi, for being here today. And thank you for being so vulnerable and sharing your challenging times, how hard you fought, and your story of recovery and resilience. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. You just listened to episode number 16, featuring our guest, Jodi, who shared her personal recovery story from opiate addiction, childhood trauma, childhood and adolescent sexual abuse, suicidal ideations, her brave journey through experimental migraine treatment surgery, and, of course, her motivational quotes that kept her going. Now, I will admit, the sound on this episode was a bit challenging, as we had a super secret guest cuddled up on the floor of Jodi's office. Make sure you check out the show notes to find out what kind of dog was snoring during our stimulating session. Since September is Suicide Awareness Month, I decided I'm going to publish it and not let perfect in sound be the enemy of good. I know you're going to enjoy it anyway. Thanks to Jodi's willingness to be vulnerable, this episode specifically included some very sensitive topics, so we highly encourage you to walk through your emotions with your loved ones, treatment professionals, and others in your support system. As a reminder, the experiences and advice expressed in this episode are the host and guest's own personal stories and do not represent the opinions of any organization or treatment location mentioned. RAN is passionate about opening the doors for all voices and experiences, not just those expressed in any particular podcast. If you want to share your experiences or expertise, we encourage you to be a featured guest by emailing us at podcast@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org or submit a blog post by emailing blog@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org. We also encourage you to comment on the episode so we can continue to provide content that is most beneficial to the community. In case you're wondering, every individual working with RAN does so on a 100% volunteer basis. All funds we raise go to support the mission. So don't forget to love, not like our podcast, and subscribe. We have already recorded some amazing episodes that I cannot wait to publish, so make sure you subscribe today. Since we were blown away by this reception, I could really use some assistance. So we are seeking a volunteer podcast publishing assistant. If you are interested, please email us at podcast@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org. We hope you will connect with us at www.recoveryadvocatenetwork.org, where you can donate to the mission, read blog posts, and stay in the loop about upcoming events. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Recovery Advocate Network and on Twitter at Ran to Wellness. If you wish to provide feedback, please feel free to leave comments on the episode or email us. And don't forget, we have our next auction coming up on October 26th through the 28th. We have some amazing donations, including autographed books from our book club, some autographed footballs, some autographed guitars, and many other amazing donations we've received. If you have some donations of items, services, or skills that you would like to provide, please email donate@recoveryadvocate.network.org. Now, thanks for joining us, and back to your coffee.